Good evening to you, and welcome to Myers Park Baptist Church. We are thrilled to have you here tonight, and we are thrilled to have our longtime friend of Myers Park Baptist Church, Frye Gaillard, returning tonight to speak to us about his book, A Hard Rain, America in the 1960s. As many of you know, Frye was a religion writer at the Charlotte Observer for a number of years and also wrote the foreword to our church's history, By a Dream Possessed, which is where I was personally first introduced to him as an author and have enjoyed reading Frye's work ever since. Frye is a native of Mobile, Alabama, and began his career as a writer and a journalist after coming of age during the turbulent events of the 1960s, which of course is what A Hard Rain is about. During the 60s, he witnessed the Birmingham arrest of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and acted as a student host for Senator Robert Kennedy at Vanderbilt University. In the years since, he has written more than 30 books, ranging across the genres of history, memoir, journalism, and historical stories for young readers. His award-winning titles include, of course, A Hard Rain, which you can purchase this evening from Park Road Books here, America in the 1960s, as well as then also Cradle of Freedom, Alabama and the Movement That Changed America, Watermelon Wine, The Spirit of Country Music, The Dream Long Deferred, The Landmark Struggle for Desegregation in Charlotte, North Carolina. That's a fabulous book if you haven't read it, about the story of desegregation here in this city. And Go South to Freedom, a novel for middle grade readers. His most recent titles include The Southernization of America, a story of democracy in the balance, co-authored with Pulitzer Prize winner Cynthia Tucker, and Live as If, a teacher's love story, which is a remembrance of his late wife, Dr. Nancy Gaillard, who died of leukemia in 2018. And I'm going to invite now Tammy Lassane, who is the organizer of this event, to come and give a few brief words and introduce Frye. Thanks, Tammy.
Thank you for coming. This is actually an event for our book club. And raise your hand if you're in our book club. Great, good to see you. And I think Ben covered everything, but I just want to say that if you haven't read A Hard Rain, you'll see that it's sort of a genre bending, because it's not just a bold capture of a turbulent decade, but it's a personal walk through the decade. And when you read the book and when you hear Frye tonight, you'll get a sense of how personal this is for him. So thank you very much for coming, Frye.
Thank you, Tammy, and thank you, Ben. It's really good to be back at Myers Park Baptist Church, one of my favorite places in Charlotte. The whole time I was here, I was telling Ben and Tammy a story that kind of captures my sense of Myers Park Baptist. I think I'll tell it, even though it's a little, it's candid, I guess is the way to put it. So I was the religion writer at the Observer back in 1978, 79, along in there. And there was a guy named Bailey Smith who was head of the Southern Baptist Convention. And Bailey Smith said somewhere in there that in his opinion, as he put it, Almighty God does not hear the prayer of a Jew. And even at the time, I thought, well, now that's a very startling thing for somebody who ought to have read the Old Testament, for example, to be saying. And so I started calling ministers to get their response. And I knew that one person you had to call if you needed a quote about something was Gene Owens, the minister at Myers Park Baptist Church. And so I called Gene Owens and I said, Gene, I wonder if you have a comment about what Bailey Smith said. And Gene said something like, oh, Lord, what'd Bailey say? And I said, I told him. And Gene said, I don't know what is wrong with Bailey Smith. I guess he's just stupid. And I said, Gene, you know you're talking to an on-duty newspaper reporter. He said, yeah, quote me. So you can find it in the annals of the Charlotte Observer. And anyway, I thought, that was sort of I don't know, in some ways lighthearted or outrageous or whatever example, though, of the kind of bold witness that this church has long been known for, and so I'm glad to be here. I'm going to talk tonight about the decade of the 1960s, maybe thinking a little bit about what it says or doesn't say about where we are today in the life of our country. And because of the setting, I'd like to talk about that period of time through the lens of faith. And not just faith in God, though that's part of it, but also faith in the ideals of America, but maybe even most broadly, faith in the idea articulated by Dr. King that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Basically, a faith that things could get better, that a great country could become greater and more inclusive, and that we would all be better if that happened. I start this very long book in North Carolina. Chapter 1 deals with events that began on the night of January 31st, 1960, when 4 freshmen at North Carolina A&T gathered in one of their dorm rooms, as they did many times, for a dormitory bull session. Franklin McCain and Joe McNeil and David Richmond and Ezel Blair were sort of self-described nerds at North Carolina A&T. They were all young men who were not the first in their families to go to college. As Franklin McCain said, and many of you may have known him during his long career in Charlotte, he said that college was just the 13th grade. These were young men who knew that they were smart, knew that they had bright futures ahead if they worked at it, and they had been told by their parents that they had to work at it. That was expected. But they also, at the age of 17 or 18, were deeply insulted by the practice of racial segregation. Everywhere they turned, there were these white-only signs and white-only restrooms and separate water fountains, and they had to ride in the back of the bus. And so on this particular night of January 31st, 1960, they started talking about these things as they had on other occasions. And on this particular night, the conversation took a turn, as it sometimes will, with teenagers, and they began to blame their parents for the situation that they were facing. Teenagers have been known to do this, as many of you who've had teenagers may remember. And they talked and they said to each other, why didn't our parents do more to change this situation? Why is it still the way it is in 1960? And then, being reflective young men, one of them said, well, wait a minute, what have we done, the 4 of us right here in this room? And the answer was nothing, basically nothing. And the more they talked about it, the worse they felt. Franklin McCain later said, I felt dirty, I felt ashamed. And so Joe McNeil, who became a general in Vietnam not long after he graduated, said, let's do something. And so the next day, with no planning or premeditation, they went down to the Woolworths, February 1st, 1960, and conducted the first sit-in of the 1960s at the Woolworths lunch counter. Now, when you think about this, it's a pretty extraordinary moment, pretty extraordinary thing that these young men did. Like almost every young black man in the South at that time, they had been raised on the story of Emmett Till, who had come south from Chicago to visit his country cousins in Mississippi, maybe said something mildly fresh to a white woman, kind of showing off for his bumpkin cousins in Mississippi, and as a result, he was murdered and his body was thrown in the river, and his mother insisted on an open casket for her son so that the world could see what had happened. And every African American man in the civil rights movement that I ever interviewed, and there were a lot of them over the years, talked about how their parents told them the story of Emmett Till and said, don't become the next Emmett Till. And the parents generally meant more than don't say anything to a white woman. They meant don't run afoul of segregation in a way that can get yourself killed. And these young men knew that they might be doing that. I mean, you know, Emmett Till said something offhandedly. They were doing a frontal assault on the very backbone of segregation. And they went and they took their seats at the counter, and they waited and they waited, and they were not served, but nothing terrible happened to them. And finally, the Woolworths manager just shut down the counter. And so finally they got up and left. That night, a young African-American theology student from Johnson C. Smith University, his name was Charles Jones, remembered that he was in Virginia riding by himself late at night in a car headed back to Charlotte from wherever he had been. And news of this sit-in came across the radio. And he said he remembered rolling down his window and looking out at the starlit sky and just exclaiming, without realizing he was going to say it, "Thank you, God, this is how we can do it." And so it was typical of the kind of inspiration that these four young men set off, that kind of swept through people their age around the South. One of the most important places that this happened was in Nashville, Tennessee, where a young, and I say young because they were all young in these days, John Lewis had grown up on a farm in Alabama, and he had come to American Baptist Theological Seminary, one of four historically black colleges in Nashville. And he had become involved with a group that included students from all four of those colleges taking classes in nonviolence. There were classes being led by three mentors to these young men and women, all of whom were men of the cloth. One of them was a man whose name was Kelly Miller Smith. Kelly Miller Smith was an African-American Baptist minister who had, in 1957, offered his 6-year-old daughter Joy as a desegregation pioneer in Nashville. She desegregated the first grade in the school to which she was assigned. And when she did that, death threats began to rain down on the Smith household, both Reverend Smith, but also death threats against Joy Smith, who was 6 years old. And one of Kelly Miller Smith's friends was a white Baptist minister named Will Campbell. Will also became an advisor to the sit-in students, but Will came over to see Kelly Smith while the threats were common and when they didn't know if they were real or not, whether there would be attempts on his life. And they were staring out the window at the dark and trying to see if they saw any shadowy movements and people maybe trying to bomb Kelly Smith's house. And Will Campbell said, "Kelly, what if something happened to little Joy?" And Kelly pulled out his Bible and he read the passage about Abraham and Isaac and how God commanded Abraham to sacrifice his son. And then they saw a ram with his horns stuck in a bush. And God relented and allowed the ram to be sacrificed instead. And Kelly read this verse and closed the book, and he looked at Will and he said, "May the ram's horns be long and may the thicket be tight." And he said, "These are some hard sayings, Will, but we're called to take these chances in order to make things better. So this was the kind of grounding that people had, and nobody was more grounded than the third of these advisors to the young people in Nashville, United Methodist minister named James Lawson. Lawson was a very close friend of Martin Luther King's. Lawson had studied nonviolence in India with the followers of Gandhi. He had served time in prison for refusing to serve in the Korean War, and his nonviolent credentials ran deep into his soul. And so he had classes for these young men and women where they not only talked about the techniques of nonviolence and how to protect yourself if you were threatened or beaten or whatever, but they talked about the theology of it, and the great leap of faith they made was that love was more powerful than hate. And you think about that. That's a remarkable assertion. I don't know if I believe that. There's mixed evidence, it seems to me, in our country today. But this was the leap that these young people made, and they believed that with their example, they could transform the country into a more loving, more inclusive place. And they began to talk about something they call the beloved community. And this was a message that became amplified by other voices, most notably probably Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And in August of 1963, Dr. King and 250,000 others who believed these kinds of things gathered on the mall in Washington, D.C. at the base of the Lincoln Memorial. And Dr. King delivered one of the great speeches in the history of American oratory, his great gift to the country being his I Have a Dream speech. And there was that refrain at the end of I Have a Dream, but it was a dream that was not only deeply rooted in the American dream, as he said, but it was also deeply rooted in the idea that we're all children of God and therefore we're brothers and sisters of each other. And one of his favorite verses that he quoted was a passage from the Hebrew prophet Amos about justice rolling down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. And one of the people who was most impressed by this as sort of the great leap of faith of the civil rights movement began to spread through American life, began to take on a life of its own that was potentially a transforming force, was a rabbi whose name was Abraham Heschel. And Heschel had written a book that King had read called The Prophets, about the Hebrew prophets and their cries for justice back in an ancient time. And Heschel thought, here's this Baptist minister from Georgia by way of Alabama, or Alabama by way of Georgia, who's quoting the Hebrew prophets as much as he is the New Testament. And it was a reminder to Heschel that we were all kind of bound together by some kind of definition of faith. And so Heschel joined King at various civil rights marches, and he used to say afterwards that he felt like his feet were praying, that it was sort of a holy exercise for him. Not everybody framed it, of course, in quite the religious way that I'm talking about right now. I think of a young man whose name was Mario Savio. Mario Savio was the spokesman for the free speech movement at Berkeley in 1964. Mario Savio had grown up in an Italian family in New York. He was a devout Catholic when he was young, but by the time he became a student at Berkeley, his Catholic faith had begun to wane, and it had been replaced by the study of philosophy. He was sort of a double major in college, philosophy and physics, because he was trying to understand the nature of things, and he thought that that was two ways of coming at the larger truth that he was trying to come to terms with. And he thought of himself as a secular person, but at the same time, he cared about things like social justice. And so in the summer of 1964, Savio was one of 1,000 volunteers who went to Freedom Summer in Mississippi. And most of you know the story of Freedom Summer, how 3 civil rights workers, on the first day that the civil rights workers, 1,000 students, most of them white, not all of them, but the majority white, descended on Mississippi to try to register voters and teach at freedom schools and all of this kind of stuff. And the first day, 3 of them were killed, were murdered, and their bodies were later found in an earthen dam. Savio is one of those students, and he spent a lot of time in Macomb, Mississippi, teaching in a freedom school. And he thought later that even though he believed that he saw himself as a secular person by now, when they would go to the mass meetings at black churches, because those were the institutions where you could hold such meetings, Savio wrote later that he felt like he was enveloped, as he put it, in the bosom of the Lord, that there was such a profound sense of community in these black communities, beleaguered as they were in Mississippi, that it had some kind of sacred or some kind of transcendent dimension to it that he carried with him back to Berkeley when Freedom Summer was over. And one of the reasons that there was a free speech movement is that Savio and other students who had had that experience wanted to talk about it on the campus at Berkeley. They wanted to hand out flyers and they wanted to have mass meetings, and you couldn't do that at Berkeley. The administration had rules against talking about controversial things on campus, which triggered then a free speech movement at Berkeley. And so it was a reminder that these movements became sort of tied together. And the civil rights movement inspired the free speech movement. It helped inspire the women's movement, which became more and more powerful as a force from 1963 with the publication of The Feminine Mystique on through the end of the decade with the work of Gloria Steinem by 1969. The movement also helped inspire the anti-war movement in Vietnam, against the war in Vietnam, the various labor movements like Cesar Chavez in California and the farm workers out there. And so it continued to be a force in American society and a force of hope in American society. And yet, as we know, looking back, it also triggered its opposite, right? There was pushback against this almost from the very beginning. One of the most dramatic stories to me was when the Freedom Riders came through Alabama in 1961, and the Greyhound bus that they were on was burned in Anniston, Alabama. And they would have burned to death on the bus, except that it so happened that there was a white undercover policeman that Governor Patterson had put on the bus just to kind of keep up with what was going on. And he had a gun, and he went to the door, and he made the Klansmen back away so that the Freedom Riders could get off the bus. And they kind of stumbled down the steps, and many of them fell choking into the grass on the side of the shoulder of the highway. And there was a white family that lived there, and the little girl in the family was 12 years old, and it touched her heart to see these people suffering, and she began to bring them water. And for that simple act of kindness, her family was harassed so badly that they had to move out of Anniston and out of the state of Alabama. We could see from that moment on how mean and how harsh the pushback against some of these demands for change could be. And then by the mid-60s, along came the war in Vietnam. And it was it may have started for, certainly in Lyndon Johnson's mind, I think, you could say the record supports the idea that he had pretty high-minded reasons. He viewed the world, as many leaders of his generation did, through the lens of communism versus the free world. It was a conception of the world that really formed in Europe after World War II. And Johnson was never able to understand that it just didn't apply to the peninsula of Vietnam. You had, you had a leader in North Vietnam named Ho Chi Minh who described himself as a communist, who had trained in the Soviet Union and learned Marxist ideology there, but who had also, when he first took power in North Vietnam, quoted extensively from the Declaration of Independence and the founding documents of the United States. He had, in fact, Ho Chi Minh had, in fact, worked with the precursor of the CIA during World War II to help locate prisoners of war in the jungles of Southeast Asia. And some of the agents who worked with Ho Chi Minh tried to tell Harry Truman and later Dwight Eisenhower that this guy actually could be an ally of ours in Asia. But our allies in Europe, the French, were trying to hold on to their control of Vietnam. And so we tragically sided with the French, and that tragedy of perception, I think, continued on through the Kennedy administration and then was escalated during the time of Lyndon Johnson. And it was a time of great suffering in Vietnam. 1 million people died over there. It was a time of great suffering in America. 50,000 of our troops died. Many more were maimed physically, and others were maimed emotionally, because they were sent off to a place where they had to fight and didn't necessarily know who the enemy would be. And it was I didn't go, I was lucky. I escaped the draft with a high draft lottery number. But I did, for this book, interview quite a few people my age who did fight in Vietnam. And the stories they told about the emotional damage that the toll that it took on them have stayed with me ever since. And so that became a reality that we dealt with in the country. From my point of view, it was not our soldiers who went to fight that I had an issue with. It was the policy that sent them there. And I think that was true of some others who were critics of Vietnam also, and certainly it was true of Dr. Martin Luther King, who reluctantly became one of the most outspoken critics of the war by 1967. He didn't want to do it because Lyndon Johnson had emerged as an ally of the civil rights movement, had pushed through, had not only introduced, but pushed through landmark civil rights and voting rights legislation, as well as programs like Medicare and Medicaid. And King could see the importance of that, and he knew that Johnson was a proud man who could also be a little bit vindictive, and he felt that the civil rights movement owed him a debt of gratitude, and he didn't want to see any criticism of his war policy coming from that corner of American life. But then in January of 1967, Martin Luther King read an issue of Ramparts magazine, a left-leaning publication in California. And in that issue, there were photographs of Vietnamese children maimed by American napalm. And King was said to be deeply shaken by this and decided finally that he could not keep silent. And so he went to, on April 4th, 1967, 1 year to the day before he was killed on April 4th, 1968. He went to Riverside Church in New York. And I'll just read a short passage about what that was like. On April 4th, accompanied by Rabbi Heschel, historian Henry Steele Commager, and John Bennett, president of Union Theological Seminary, King ascended the pulpit beneath the great stone arches of what he called this great, magnificent house of worship. At times, he sounded like the preacher he was. The calling to speak is a vocation of agony, but we must speak. We must speak with all the humility that is appropriate to our limited vision, but we must speak. But much of the time, what he offered was a history lesson, which was fitting enough since the speech was drafted by Harlem-born historian Vincent Harding. Having worked with Harding's words to make them his own, King talked of a war that undermined the national fight against poverty by sapping it of necessary funds. He spoke of how the burden of battle in the faraway land fell disproportionately on African Americans. But much of what he talked about was a history of suffering in Vietnam. As I ponder the madness of Vietnam, my mind goes constantly to the people of that peninsula. I speak now not of the soldiers of each side, not of the junta in Saigon, but simply of the people who have been living under the curse of war for almost 3 continuous decades. I think of them too because it is clear to me that there will be no meaningful solution there until some attempt is made to know them and to hear their broken cries. The response to that speech was quite remarkable when you look back on it. Newspapers, even the most liberal newspapers in the country, like the Washington Post, just railed against King and said he ought to stick to his lane, basically. What does he really know about foreign policy? Some called him an agent of Hanoi. And there was one exception, interestingly, because ultimately it connected to Charlotte. Mark Etheridge, the editor of the Detroit Free Press, sided with King and said that this was actually a wise and brave speech that had been given. That Mark Etheridge's son became the managing editor of the Charlotte Observer. Mark and I used to argue about which of us was the first reporter hired by Jim Batten, who was a great editor of the Observer back in those days. And probably Mark had the better of the argument because Batten had hired him first. But I was the first Batten employee to get there. And so I was happy to try to one-up Mark as best I could. Mark was a great journalist, helped lead the paper, as did my friend Ed Williams, who is here tonight, to Pulitzer Prize, and made it a real privilege for me to work there for as long as I did. Martin Luther King in these times was becoming more and more radicalized in the late 60s, not only about the issue of war, but also about the issue of poverty in America. He looked at the gap in income in this country, and he thought to himself, the civil rights movement has had some concrete goals. We wanted to end segregation. We wanted to secure the right to vote. But the third great area of concern for him was an area that he thought of as economic justice. And his formulation of that was still a work in progress when he went to Memphis in 1968. And he went there because James Lawson, who had been an advisor to the sit-in movement, was a minister in Memphis at that point. And Lawson had taken up the cause of black sanitation workers in Memphis who were marching for a living wage and for safer working conditions. And Lawson asked King to come to Memphis, and King did. And on the night of April 3rd, there was a mass meeting at a church, and Dr. King was sick that night. He had a bad cold. He also, in those days, apparently was more and more despondent. He looked around, he saw riots in the cities in the summers, he saw division over the war in Vietnam, he saw people questioning the philosophy of nonviolence, and he was struggling with the notion, apparently, that his life's work had been a failure. When we think about all the monuments and recognitions and the national holiday and all of that, it's somehow humanizing and poignant, isn't it, to think that this great man wondered if he was in fact a failure. And so he was staying in his hotel room, and he sent Ralph Abernathy to the church to make the speech that he was scheduled to make, that King was scheduled to make. And Abernathy went to the church and in a little while called King's room and said, they're having none of it. Abernathy was a pretty good speaker, but he called King and said, no, they want you. You have to come. And so King dragged himself out of bed, and he headed over to this church, and he didn't feel well, and he was depressed and despondent, and yet he summoned from deep inside himself somewhere this faith that he had begun with. And he gave his promised land speech. I may not get there with you, but we as a people will get to the promised land. That was the last speech that he ever gave, and it was one he could barely bring himself to make because on a personal, human level, he was at a very low point, and yet he had this faith in what they were trying to do, not just a faith in God, but a faith in what needed to happen, a faith in the arc of the moral universe, maybe. And he came and he bestowed that upon this church and in a way upon all of us. And then the next day on his balcony at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, he was shot by a high-powered rifle and killed. The other person that I was paying close attention to myself in those days, who gave me hope in a way that Dr. King gave me hope, was Robert Kennedy. Robert Kennedy apparently was just jolted to his very core when his brother was assassinated. He had been willing up until then to kind of do the cynical, dirty work for his brother's political career. But according to people who knew Kennedy well, and I was fortunate to interview quite a few of those, his own pain that he felt at the death of his brother was so acute that he found himself identifying with people who hurt all over the world. Certainly in this country, whether it was in the coal fields of Appalachia or Indian reservations or in the ghettos of the inner city, wherever there were people who felt themselves pushed to the margins, here was this amazingly wealthy and privileged man who knew that he was wealthy and privileged, who identified with this kind of hurt in a way that was so visceral that the people in those circumstances who listened to him just felt in an undeniable way that this was a guy who cared about their circumstances. So on the night of April 4th, the night that Martin Luther King was killed, Robert Kennedy was scheduled to make a talk in Indianapolis, in the black inner city of Indianapolis. And he learned on the way to the talk that Martin Luther King had been killed, scratched out a few notes, and knew that he had to go into the inner city and give this talk. And the police said, no, don't go there. It's too dangerous. And Kennedy said, I have to. And they said, we're not going with you. We're not going to protect you. And he said, that's okay. And so before I move toward opening this up for questions, I would like to read from the passage of what happened that night in Indianapolis. Robert Kennedy was on his way to Indianapolis when he heard the news. He was beginning his campaign in Indiana, a primary he knew he had to win, much as his brother in 1960 had needed to win in West Virginia. That economically ravaged backwater of Appalachia was where JFK laid to rest the idea that a Catholic could not win in the heartland. Now in Indiana, the younger Kennedy would have to earn the votes of alienated whites, many of whom had voted for George Wallace in 1964. RFK, as a champion of the poor and dispossessed, of blacks and Indians and Mexican Americans, knew he faced an uphill climb. But he also knew, both personally and politically, that he could not turn his back on the ghetto, and that was where he began. On the flight to Indianapolis for a scheduled rally in the inner city, a New York Times reporter told Kennedy that King had been shot. By the time the plane landed, they knew that King had died. Jack Newfield, another reporter, reported later that Kennedy wept, perhaps for the country, perhaps in private memory of his brother, though his grief, in a sense, was more generic than personal. He did not know Dr. King very well. The two of them, by most accounts, never quite understood or trusted one another. But Kennedy did understand King's importance for the African American community. When police officials in Indianapolis warned him not to venture into that part of town, for on this night especially it would be too dangerous for any white man to go there, Kennedy brushed the warnings aside. Even when police refused to go with him or to offer protection, Kennedy forged ahead. He found a crowd of 1,000 people waiting, milling around, hunched against the cold. Remarkably, in this era before cable news and the internet cycle, they did not yet know that King had been shot. It fell to Robert Kennedy to tell them. Standing on a flatbed truck, wearing an oversized coat that once belonged to his brother, he began in a flat and somber voice. I have some bad news for you, for all of our fellow citizens and people who love justice all over the world. And that is that Martin Luther King was shot and killed tonight. As Kennedy biographer Evan Thomas recounted, there was a collective gasp and shouts of no, no. Kennedy paused briefly and then continued to speak. He had scribbled some notes before he arrived, but he paid no attention to them now. The words simply came. Martin Luther King dedicated his life to love and to justice for his fellow human beings, and he died because of that effort. In this difficult day, in this difficult time for the United States, it is perhaps well to ask what kind of a nation we are and what direction we want to move in. For those of you who are black, considering the evidence, there evidently is that there were white people who were responsible, you can be filled with bitterness, with hatred, and a desire for revenge. We can move in that direction as a country in great polarization, black people amongst black, white people amongst white, filled with hatred toward one another. Or we can make an effort, as Martin Luther King did, to understand and to comprehend and to replace that violence, that stain of bloodshed that is spread across our land, with an effort to understand with compassion and love. For those of you who are black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and distrust at the injustice of such an act against all white people, I can only say that I feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, and he was killed by a white man. But we have to make an effort in the United States. We have to make an effort to understand, to go beyond these rather difficult times. My favorite poet was Aeschylus. He wrote, "In our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God." And so there were these words of hope on the other side of this violent, obscene tragedy And Indianapolis was the only major city in America that did not erupt into riots that night. Almost certainly, that speech was the reason, at least most people looking back believe that was the case. And then, a little over 2 months later, Robert Kennedy also was assassinated, lay on the floor, bleeding from a gunshot wound to the head, his head cradled against the concrete by a young Mexican-American busboy named Juan Romero. Kennedy, a couple of nights earlier, had been in his hotel room, and Juan Romero had delivered his room service dinner to the room. And Romero would remember later how Kennedy didn't just take the dinner and offer a tip and go back in the room. They talked for a few minutes. Kennedy asked Romero about his background and his life and his hopes. And Romero said, "He made me feel like a human being." And then Romero said that he cradled the bleeding head because I just didn't want it to touch the cold floor. And so we're left with those images of the 60s. We're left with those people who offered such profound hope and inspiration. We're left with the witness of the young men and women who demonstrated, whose names we'll never know. Some of them we do, some we don't. We're left with that example, and we're also left with the memory of the opposite. And it seems to me that, history doesn't stop, it continues, and that both of those truths about that decade have continued on into our current time. And as we struggle with that kind of schizophrenia in our character, who are we really? It's harder and harder to know, We may learn a lot in November. And it's both terrifying to think how it could go, and yet there are a lot of people who don't want it to go that way. And even so, we're going to have to fight for it, in some, I don't necessarily mean violently, but we're going to have to stand up for it, to hold on to the best of who we are and keep that at the heart of what our country is and the way our country is governed. And so I find myself thinking about this decade in which I came of age, that I felt very fortunate to be able to write about, looking for hope, looking for inspiration. And I see people who offer it today. I don't know if I see the same transcendent figures that we saw in Dr. King or Robert Kennedy. But there are people out there who are raising their voices and doing so with eloquence and passion and bravery. And so maybe something to think about. And I think on that note, I will stop and ask for questions or comments or thoughts that you may have. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for your presentation. Really appreciate it. I'm curious, as you look back on the 60s, especially the late 60s, how do you compare that time with the way the country was in terms of where it was not united, where it was united, and compared to the time we live in now? I was old enough to remember some things from the late 60s, and from middle class background, and I don't remember the sense of polarization. And we were just outside of DC, and we were pretty connected with what was going on. Right. But I don't remember the sense of polarization among middle class folks that I see about here now. So just your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I do believe it's worse now. There were certainly divisions then over the war in Vietnam. There were a lot of white people who were worried about things like riots in the inner cities in the summer and crime rates in the inner cities, and you had politicians who deliberately, mostly on the political right, who deliberately sought to conflate riots and crime on the one hand with civil rights activism on another, and set out to try to make white people afraid of black people, and with some success. And yet the voices of Dr. King and others were resonant enough, I think, that I still felt hopeful. I felt heartbroken because these powerful voices had been stilled, but I don't remember feeling despair during those times, which I've struggled with now. I have to fight against a sense of despair now. So, anybody else? Yeah, Mark.
About another very important person that you and I share an interest in, which is President Jimmy Carter, who also came out of a religious background, very much so, resonating with where we are right now. And talk maybe a little bit about how Carter fits into not just the present, but also in response to the 60s, how the things that were happening during the 1960s might have shaped Carter's world point of view.
Yeah. Carter was one of several what were called at the time New South governors who ran for or were elected to office in 1969, 1970, which was actually a bipartisan phenomenon. Linwood Holton, who was elected governor of Virginia in, I think, 1969, it might have been 1970, but I think it was 69, was a Republican who was very much an advocate of civil rights and believed learn from the lessons of the 60s, particularly in the South, and we needed to move on to better times. Reuben Askew in Florida was a Democrat who also believed that and was so competent that the John Kennedy Center for Government, or whatever it's called at Harvard, named him one of the 10 best governors of the 20th century in this country. And then, of course, there was Carter, who ran and was elected in 1970, and in his inaugural address said the time for racial discrimination is over. And Carter talked about how his foreign policy, that he wanted to center as president as much as possible on the concept of human rights, was really born with the concept of civil rights in, the state of Georgia, where he'd grown up in the American South. And he really hoped we could export the best of the South and that it could shape a more humane and moral foreign policy for the country. And, there are critics who talk about the imperfections of Carter's foreign policy. He continued to support the Shah of Iran, for example, despite an atrocious human rights record there, which may have led to the hostage crisis, which led to the undoing of Carter's presidency. So there are always complications when you are president of the United States and there are competing imperatives that you have to kind of manage, and I think Carter did his best to do that. What I think is unassailable is that in the time after his presidency, Carter continued to be driven by that notion of human rights rooted in civil rights in the American South, in terms of his everything that he tried to do with the Carter Center, whether it was whether it was supervising elections or whether it was eradicating disease. I mean, that affirmation of the humanity of people on the margins in the world became central to the legacy that Jimmy Carter, I think, leaves behind. Carter's not a perfect man. I've interviewed him quite a few times. Sometimes he can be abrupt. He can be, if he's trying to get from point A to point B and you're in the way, you can feel the chill of his displeasure. I mean, he's not altogether warm and fuzzy, and yet here's a singular life dedicated to making things better for as many people in the world as possible. And I think, and I've heard Carter talk about this in Sunday school classes that he taught, an extraordinary experience going to hear him teach Sunday school, that, he saw the spark of the divine in people, He believed that we were all created by God and therefore were deserving of as much respect and opportunity as the world could be persuaded to afford, what he would call the least of these, the people pushed to the margins of life in whatever country they might be living in. So I think those ideas for Carter came into focus in the 1960s. I mean, he went from being pretty moderate on the issue of race to being, pretty deeply committed to the idea of racial justice and justice among all peoples in the world, I think. One over here.
This might be out of your purview, but I know you have thoughts about Barack Obama.
Right.
How does he fit? That day in 2008 when he was elected, I felt like America was back. America was going someplace again.
Right.
But then we know what happens.
Yeah.
And I just wonder, how does he fit? Has he still got a role that he can play?
Yeah, I felt the same way you did in 2008. Barack Obama, I felt as hopeful in 2008 listening to Barack Obama as I did in 1968 listening to Robert Kennedy. I thought that in terms of the idealism of their fundamental message, they were cut from the same kind of cloth. At least that's the way it struck my mind and heart when I listened to Obama in 2008. And I was astonished, I think, at the ugliness of the backlash against him. Not that you couldn't disagree with his policies, right? I mean, his policies maybe with regard to Syria didn't work out in the way he hoped, or maybe some people on the political left thought that, he deported too many immigrants. Maybe some people on the political right thought he didn't deport enough, to decide is to divide, as one commentator said. And so inevitably there are going to be critics of a president. But instead what happened, or in addition what happened, was that people said he was a Muslim born in Kenya. They called him a monkey. They said his wife was not really a woman. I mean, it was so ugly. Somebody actually took a shot at the White House and at the bedroom where the Obamas were sleeping. That person is now in prison. So the backlash was so ugly. The fact that this country could not almost universally acknowledge that this was a beautiful American family. Those two amazing little girls growing up, the way the Obamas tried to shield them as best they could from the worst of what was going on in the country, the beauty of that marriage, their obvious commitment to each other. The ugliness of all of that just threw me for a loop. And the fact that it continued to gain momentum and that Obama would be succeeded by his opposite is incredibly disheartening to me, incredibly disheartening. And, now 8 years later, I mean, who knows where we're going? That's incredibly disheartening. I think Obama still stands for the for the good things. Every time Obama says something, recently he wrote the obituary for his mother-in-law. I don't know if you've read that, but check it out if you get a chance. Who came to the White House and helped raise the daughters. It's beautiful. It's beautiful, what Obama wrote about his mother-in-law. And so we are reminded of the humanity and the grace and the elegance of this man who, like every president, I guess, had a mixed record of success and failure, but who, stood, I thought, for the best within us. I place him as a continuation of the best that I saw in the 1960s. And I think he talks about that. He talks about the inspiration he drew from Dr. King and John Lewis and others, So, yeah, anyway. Cool guy. It used to be kind of a tradition that you don't try to second guess the person in office. It was a club that, was a pretty elite club of ex-presidents. But, Obama couldn't stay silent because the president was Donald Trump, And so, so I don't know. I think he's a little ambivalent about speaking out. I sometimes feel that way, and yet he does sometimes, and I'm always glad. Yeah, Jonathan?
Yeah, Frye, earlier you mentioned Will Campbell, and he always thought of himself as a maverick Baptist minister,
right.
And he was very instrumental in his civil rights fight. Can you speak to his contribution to civil rights?
Yeah, so Jonathan was asking about Will Campbell, who was a Southern Baptist minister born in Emmett County, Mississippi, deep in the heart of Mississippi. In 1924, the same year that Jimmy Carter was born, in fact, they became friends later in Campbell's life, and Campbell grew up just sort of never believing that white people were better than black people. He had a grandfather who sort of didn't believe that, and his father didn't act that way. It wasn't based in anything particularly deep. He just thought it was tacky, to treat bad, right? And then he grew up and studied more theology and went to Yale Divinity School and, developed this kind of theology. In the way he phrased his understanding of the role of faith, he said, we're all bastards, but God loves us anyway. And basically what he was saying is that, if you're a person of faith, you believe that this undeserved shower of divine forgiveness rains down on all of us. We don't deserve it, and yet there it is, and so we should be inspired by it in the way we treat each other. That was his theology, and you didn't have to include God in it for it to mean that you treat each other with respect. I mean, the golden rule, however you want to phrase it. And Campbell was pretty unorthodox in the way he approached this, because he at one point he started thinking about who was Jesus talking about when he said, "Inasmuch as you've done it to the least of these, you've done it unto me." And he said to himself, well, certainly he was talking about African Americans and people who are gay and, whatever. But he said, I wonder, this is Campbell talking to himself, he said, I wonder if he's also talking about the poor dumb bastards who are in the Ku Klux Klan. And so he started his own ministry to members of the Ku Klux Klan, in which he just treated them like human beings, and wound up converting quite a few to the notion of that we're all brothers and sisters. So he's a pretty unorthodox guy. He preached at this church 2 or 3 times, and sometimes would just to be perverse, would criticize the beauty of Myers Park Baptist Church. You could be spending that money on whatever. He kind of enjoyed annoying Gene Owens that way, I think. But anyway, he was a maverick. He was a renegade. He was a funny guy. Had a great sense of humor, but he was the only white minister at the founding of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He walked with the members of the Little Rock Nine through the mob in Little Rock, and he just kept showing up, and trying to do things for people on the margins. His farmhouse in Tennessee was, he thought, a kind of way station for young men trying to get to Canada to avoid the draft, sort of an underground railroad way station for people like that. He was very outspoken about issues like gay rights and women's rights. So just a real interesting guy, and no stranger. It's not surprising that he would be invited to speak at this church a few times because, despite the fact that he was a little ornery about it, there was a real provocative, inspirational quality about his theology, I think, and his message. And it was always really well received here. So, interesting guy. Yes.
I'll tell you a Will Campbell story.
All right.
From when he was here one time. You mentioned the 4 young men who eventually did the sit-ins, asking themselves, what have we done?
Right.
Will was here and made one of his rousing sermons, and then we had talk back. And someone asked what we could do if we really wanted to make a difference in Charlotte. And he said, well, you could leave your doors open. He said, a lot of people in Charlotte who are homeless don't have any place to sleep. He said, you heat the place, you have running water all the time. Just let them come in and use your facilities. And people kind of, he said, you might have to clean up a little bit after them, but that would be good. But that's Will Campbell.
Yeah.
When he was advisor to the Baptist Student Union at Ole Miss in the late 1950s, he was saying some of his heretical things about racism and segregation. And they were hosting a party at the Baptist Student Union one night, and someone came up and said, what's this in the punch bowl? And he went over and looked, and someone had expressed their opposition to Will by leaving a turd in the punch bowl. Earthy man who got an earthy response. But right. I was thinking about something else you said. We'd have plenty as a country to disagree about, even without race. But I was in Mississippi in the 1960s as a student and as a reporter. And if you want to know how bad America could get, Mississippi in the 1960s would show you the potential.
Right.
And I grew up in a town that was one of those tiny little towns on the Missouri-Arkansas border about 90 miles north of Memphis, in which no black people lived, though in the surrounding county there were many black people. It was called a sundown town or sunset town,
right.
In which black people were told, don't be here after the sun goes down.
Right.
So I had formed no direct impressions or opinions based on experience about race. Then I got to Mississippi in 1960 to go to college, and found that all the Mississippi students there apparently had been instructed in what to think about race by every institution they encountered for all their lives.
Right.
And it reminded me of the saying of I think it was a maybe an 18th century Frenchman, that people who believe absurdities will commit atrocities.
Oh,
and
yeah.
there were a lot of atrocities committed in Mississippi at that time by people
Right.
who believed absurdities about race.
Right. Right.
And I think that's one of the things that drove me into journalism,
Right.
that I thought journalism provided an opportunity to at least give people enough facts
Right.
that they had no excuse
Right.
for believing absurdities. I noticed that facts don't seem to make that much difference anymore.
Right.
But the thing that, we're immensely better in some ways on race. Remember Aaron Henry, who was the state NAACP chairman in Mississippi, when his critics accused him of trying to make white people love black people. He said, "No, we don't want that. Just stop killing us."
Yeah.
And
Right.
that's come a long way, but we've still got so far to go, and there are so many guises for racist activities these days.
Yeah. Yeah.
Basically a glass half full person, but I'm not so sure about race, whether white people can get beyond it. There's too much teaching still going on about that. Well, so what do you think? The question.
What you said. No, I worry about that. I mean that's a great quote about people believing absurdities, willing to commit atrocities. And there are a lot of people these days believing absurdities, right? I mean, that was one of the, in another book of mine, The Southernization of America, Cynthia Tucker and I wrote about one of the first things Donald Trump did in office was to claim that his inaugural crowd was bigger than Barack Obama's, which it was not, right? All the photographs made that clear. And I remember thinking at the time, well, this is just absurd. And then later, and we wrote about it this way in the book, we concluded it was deliberately absurd. It was an absurdity. It was the first shot in the war to blur the lines between fact and non-fact. And so as we become more deeply embedded in that reality of Trump's remarkable creation. I mean, just the fact that he had the temerity and the determination to do it and has been as successful as he has is an amazing thing to me and deeply disturbing. And when you add that, the belief in absurdity, to the long history of race, and I agree with you that we've made lots of progress in many ways, and yet there's something scary about the issue of race that goes very deep. And I think one of the ways that I personally am inclined to frame the question, having grown up next door to Mississippi where you came of age, is whether that flaw just runs too deep for us to deal with it. Whether, I hope not. I try, like you, to be a glass half full person. I always thought you were better at that than I was, but I was glad that you were there to, in a leadership position in the Charlotte Observer, being the glass is half full. So I don't know. I think there are a lot of questions about that still to be answered. Tammy, how are we doing on time? I can't see the clock back there. Okay. All right.
There are books available for sale back here if anybody would like to purchase one. I had hoped we would have a little bit of time for Frye to do some signing, but I think we're hard up on what we have to leave at 8.
Okay. Well, I'll wander back that way unless you have
Thank you. We just wanted to say thank you, Frye. Let's give him another round of applause. Thank you.